Hey there, Stacy. How you doing?
I'm not doing bad, thank you. How are you doing?
Great, thanks. Thanks for being our guest for the show.
Yeah,
What a
thanks for having
great,
me.
what a great room you have there with lots of Lego.
You've got to have Lego.
Sure. Yeah.
Lego is definitely my thing at the moment. I'm building. I think I'm building like 3 models at the moment, and I've got a pile of 7 boxes left to open.
Oh wow.
Oh
Yeah.
wow, nice.
I also really like it. I only have my Volkswagen up here, my Volkswagen touring
I
bus.
love
It's really
that
nice.
camper.
Yeah, but I have another couple of models I still have to build. But I actually built them and then I took them apart and put them back in the boxes for later on. But I will start building them and filling it up behind me because I really like that. So I guess we're going to talk about static web apps today, right?
We're going to be talking about static web apps today, the amazing resource inside of Azure. It's really my favorite resource at the moment to
Mhm.
get something just out to the web as simply as possible with only one resource inside of Azure. It's
Yeah,
that
that's
last
cool.
one that really gets me.
Yeah, and do you have something running? I guess your blog runs on static web apps, right?
My blog does run on a static web app. It runs on a static web app. It's using a Blazor WebAssembly front end,
Cool.
and
Ah,
then
okay.
it's running a .NET Function API because
Oh,
I publish my blogs to dev.to, and I
mhm.
actually read from their API, translate it into my own format, and then push it out to my website.
Oh, pretty nice. Well, we will put a link in the show notes so people can check it out. But yeah, I think it's time for you to take over and start talking about this cool technology.
Yeah, thank you very much. If you want to share my screen then.
Yes, we'll do that.
And hello, everybody. Thanks for spending some time with me. I'm going to be talking to you today about static web apps inside of Azure, in fact, authentication inside of Azure Static Web Apps. As I was saying, Azure Static Web Apps, they are probably my favorite resource inside of Azure right now because you can get something out to the web so simply and with a small amount of work as possible. And you do that all inside of one single Azure resource, which makes it easier to manage. Of course, inside of that resource, we have our client application. We have, if you want it, an API running in whatever language of Azure functions that you want to use, as long as it's HTTP triggered. And then on top of that, we have a load of code, which we never get to see. We don't have to code, and we can't get wrong, to glue it all together and turn it into one single amazing application. Part of that glue is the authentication process. Inside of the free tier for an Azure Static Web App, we have a number of authentication providers given to us out of the box. Providers which are implemented in such a way that even if you're not an authentication expert, it makes it easy to get authentication into your application. You need something more complex, you need to plug into your own authentication process. You can go for the standard tier, it's only about $10 a month or so. And then you can implement your own authentication provider and hook into what you need to. We're not going to be touching that today. Today, we're just going to stick with the standard tier, but it's always good to know that it exists. Hi, I'm Stacy Cashmore. I'm Tech Explorer DevOps at Omniplan in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And I've been developing software since the middle of the 1990s. For the last 2 years, I've been really honored to be able to call myself a Microsoft MVP. So let's start today by looking at the application that we're going to be using to explore the authentication process in Azure Static Web Apps. Now, anybody who's ever played with Blazor, you're going to notice that this looks pretty much like a scaffolded out of the box application with just 2 small tweaks to it. Up in the top corner over here, we have information about the authentication provider that we've used to log in. Right now, we're not logged in, so we don't have anything. And at the bottom, we have a login button. Now, this is just something that I added to take me to a page where I can link to lots of different authentication providers. Right now, these 4 are the ones that we can use inside of our Azure Static Web App. We can sign in with Microsoft, or more accurately, we can sign in with Azure Active Directory. We can sign in with a GitHub account, with a Twitter handle, and in preview, we can sign in with Google. In the future, Facebook is going to be added. It's in preview right now, but unless you're in a private preview, you can't use it. So I can't put it on this screen yet, unfortunately. So how do these work? Well, all of these providers go to a particular place on the inside of an Azure Static Web App. Now, I'm going to click on this button, but actually I'm not going to click on the button. I'm going to type it into the URL because I want to show you where I'm going to. So inside of every Azure Static Web App, there is a folder called Auth. Inside of there, there's a folder called Login, and then there's several pages which take care of the authentication process for us. Now, as I say, I've not written anything here. This is all included in the Azure Static Web App itself. When I go here, and assuming I've not done a typo in the URL, we go to Twitter, and then we come back to my application, and I now have an auth provider of Twitter, and I'm logged in as a standard user. So we can do this for each one of the providers that we have. You've got AAD for Active Directory, GitHub for GitHub, Google for Google. And there's no code there that we actually need to interact with. It is just a page that we go to. That page takes care of the authentication for us. And then we just get information back about the person that's logged in. So what information do we get? Well, again, if we just go to .auth/me, then we get a JSON object back with a client principal, and this gives us information about the user that's logged in. Now, this information only comes back if you have that secret in the cookie from the Azure Static Web App, so it's nice and secure, and it tells us a few bits of information. It tells us what authentication provider the person used to log in, so in this case, Twitter. It tells us our user ID. Now, this one's a bit interesting because this is generated every time you log into a new Azure Static Web App. So if I generated a second version of this page on a different Azure Static Web App, I would get a different user ID. I'm not doxing myself by showing you this number. After that, we get our user details. This changes depending on which authentication provider you're using to log in. If you log in via Google or via Active Directory, then it will give you the email address of the person that logged in. If you log in via GitHub or via Twitter, then you get the handle of the person that comes back. So I am Stacy_Cash on Twitter, so I've logged in with Stacy_Cash. Finally, we get the user roles. What is our person authorized to do? And by default, every single person that logs in gets 2 user roles. They get anonymous and they get authenticated. So this is all really cool. We get this out of the box. I've not written anything for these last few things that I've shown you. It's just something you get for free. But I'm running inside of Azure right now. I'm running in the Azure resource right now. That doesn't necessarily work when I'm running locally. If I want to develop against this and I want to test what happens when I'm logged into my account, I really don't want to keep on doing a deploy, doing a test, making a change, doing a deploy, doing a test. That is not the developer inner loop that we're looking for. Thankfully, it's also not the one that we need to use. What you can use is something called the Static Web Apps CLI. Now, this is currently in preview. You can install it from npm, and it replicates the functionality of an Azure Static Web App on your local machine. Now, I'm going to come back to this a couple of times over the course of this evening. It replicates the functionality of a static web app locally. It doesn't give you an Azure Static Web App locally. It might be kind of a semantic difference between the two, but there's a couple of important points that make sure that you need to know to remember that. Now, we're not going to go too deep into the static web app today because that is literally a talk on its own. But we are going to fire it up and we're going to run the static web app locally. So what command are we using for this? Well, at the moment, inside of the Azure Static Web App, we only have one command, and that is the start command. And we are going to say that every request that comes to the client of our Azure Static Web App, we want to point that to HTTP localhost 5000. That's where our client is going to be running. Next, we want to point to our API location. Now, I've pointed this to a folder. So what the Static Web App CLI is going to do is go into that folder, check to see if there's an Azure function there. And if there is, it's going to run it. Finally, localhost 5000. Anybody who's developed with .NET knows that that is the default .NET Core URL when you're debugging. So we need to get our site running. So the last thing we're going to do is run a run command with .NET Watch Run. Only we're running in the base of our project, so we need to tell it where to run it from. So we're going to set our project to /client. So when we run this now, and we keep our fingers crossed that everything's going to work as it should do, because demos are always interesting. We're going to wait for localhost 5000 to be ready because it needs to know where to direct those requests to. It's going to give me warnings because I've got nullables turned on. It's running my API. And here we go. We have a localhost 4280. And this is going to be our static web app. So if we bring this back into a browser and we run this, we get a page which, when it downloads the Blazor runtime in a debug environment, looks exactly the same as our production place, which is kind of what we would expect because it's what we were hoping for. So let's try and log in here and see what happens. So we're going to go to login. We're going to go to Twitter. And here we have a different page. We are not going to Twitter in order to authenticate our user. What we're going to do instead is pretend that we've been to Twitter, and we get to decide what username, what user ID, and what user roles we're going to give our test user. We can't change the provider because we've come to the Twitter address. So this is the Twitter authentication provider. But we can make a change to all of the other things. So if we log in now, we come back to our application. There we go. Takes a little bit longer under the CLI than it does running in actual Azure. We have our authentication provider back as Twitter. We have our standard user, and this is now working for us. This step in particular, it's probably one of my favorite of the local loop when working with authentication inside of static web apps. I love it because faking these endpoints means that we can forego that testing step of setting up a user in every different provider that we want to support. It means that we can forego the steps of having to make sure that we have users with the right roles, or having to go through the bureaucracy of getting those roles changed on all of our test users, so that we can test different scenarios on the fly as we go. And it means that, unlike as I've had in many projects in my career, having to share login information for test users, we can just share that user details and that user ID, and everybody can use the same user if they want to, or they can make up their own. It really does simplify the whole logging in process and allow you to just concentrate on the development side. So speaking of the development side, I think it's time to see some code. What I want to show you first is how we use the authentication inside of our application. Now, as I said, my application is written in Blazor, so this is going to be quite Blazor specific. But you're going to see about halfway through the one important line of code, which no matter what framework you're using, you're going to need to replicate. So because we're in Blazor, the first thing we're going to go to is a program CS, and we're going to add to our services static web app authentication. Now, at this point, I need to say that I got this code from Anthony Chu. I'm going to ask for the link to his repo to be put into the show notes. Really nice way of adding authentication for your Blazor application here, and I really want to thank him for doing that work so that it was easy for me to add. So inside of this static web app authentication, we do two things. We add our authorization core, which is just from the ASP.NET Core authorization namespace. And then we add a scoped authentication state provider. And for that, we need to implement something ourselves. And that's going to be our static web app authentication state provider. Inside of here, the one function that we need to worry about is a get authentication state async. And the first thing that that does is it goes to that .auth/me page and gets that client principal information. This is the bit where no matter what framework you're using, you're going to need to do this call in order to get the authentication inside of your application. The next thing that we're going to do after we've extracted the client principal from the response that we get is remove the anonymous user role. Why are we going to do that? Well, because the next line down, we check to see if we have any roles left over. We don't care if somebody's anonymous. If they're anonymous and they're only anonymous, we're going to treat them as not logged in because remember, all of our users are going to have authenticated as well. If we do have roles left over, then we can make our claims identity to use. So here we are going to make a claims identity based on the identity provider. So that would be Twitter in the examples I've shown so far. We're going to add a name identifier, which is going to be that user ID generated by your static web app. This is how you can check if someone comes and logs into your site again, that it's the same person. Then we're going to add the name claim type. And I always find this one a little bit interesting because no matter what provider you use, we never add a name here. We're adding an email address or we're adding a handle from an account. Not a name, but it kind of works. And then finally, we just add all of those user roles which are left over. After this point, we're logged in and we can just use it as we normally would inside of an application. So inside of a Blazor application, the first thing we're going to do is add a cascading authentication state to our app.razor. From here on in, we can now check to see whether or not a user is authorized in any of the components that we use. So we have two places. We have the navigation menu and we have that auth provider in the top corner. So in our main layout, we have our authorized view. And if somebody is authorized, then we just show the authentication type. If somebody's not authorized, we show that they're not logged in. And in the navigation menu, we do something slightly more complex. If somebody is authorized, then we change the navigation menu not to go to that login screen, but to go to the log out screen so that we can let the users log out. And the other one that I've done just because I wanted to play and have a look at something with roles is we have a check here. Is this person a super user? If they are, then put super user on the screen. And if they're not, they're just a standard user. So we're just going to display that. And of course, if they're not authorized, then we just show a login button and allow them to get authorized. So before we have a look at the API side, let's just try this one. If we get a super user and we go back to our application, let's log out and wait for Blazor and then log back in again. We're going to log back in with Twitter and we are going to add that super user. Now when I log in, if everything's gone to plan, we now have this super user available to us. And that is as easy as it is in order to give your test users extra roles to make sure your application is behaving as you want it to do for people with more privileges than a standard user. So that's our client. This is how we can ensure that we have the right user on the front end. How about on the back end? If we're dealing with data, if we are storing data, if we are reading data, and that data is specific to the user that's logged in, we need to be able to recognize them. So how do we do that? Well, to be honest, it is in a remarkably similar way. Inside of our API, we can check for this header. Now, this XMS client principal header, it doesn't exist in any of the communication from the browser. This happens after a request has gone through the Azure Static Web App. You've been authenticated inside of the Static Web App, and before it then relays that request out to the API, it will add this header to it. It's a base 64 string, but if you decode it, what you end up with is that very same client principal. And that means that the code underneath looks amazingly similar to what we had on the front end. We remove the anonymous role, and if you have no roles left over, we assume you're not logged in. If you do have roles left over, then we create a claims identity for you, and we add your identity provider, your user ID, your user details, and all of your roles. From here on in, we know who you are. We can get data based on your user ID. We can allow you to save data based on your user ID, and we can build complex applications to support multiple users. What about if you don't want somebody to access an API, though? Well, obviously, if somebody needs a certain role, you can always code it directly inside of here. We can get those roles back. We can say that if you don't have role super user, then you should be unauthorized. Thankfully, there's an easier way to do this. We don't need to put this code into each one of our functions. Because these functions aren't exposed to the outside world, you can only access them via the Azure Static Web App itself. We can use the Azure Static Web App to help us. So if we come and have a look at this static web app config JSON. The static web app config, this is another one that you can almost do a talk on just by itself. It's got so much functionality that allows you to control your static web app. We're just going to be looking at the roots here, and more specifically, the allowed roles. So we have 3 roots that we want to look at right now. An authentication test, where you need to be a super user. Authentication test 2, you just need to be authenticated. And just because I think that we should only allow authenticated users to count, we're going to restrict access to the counter as well, so that people can't access it. This being in the static web app config, this is all taken care of on the server. You don't need to do anything to make this work, as long as this file is correct. So let's take a look at that in action. Go back to our application here. Let's log out again. And this is one of those times when I'm going to say running inside of the Static Web App CLI is not the same as running inside of an Azure resource itself, because this demo, it's got about a 50% hit rate. So let's keep our fingers crossed that you see the right things here. So the first thing that I want to do, I want to go to that counter page. And I can't. If I try and go to the counter page, I get that 401 unauthorized. This is good. We're not allowed to access this resource, and we can't. And then what about those 2 APIs? Well, let's go to authentication test first. And we also get unauthorized. We're not allowed to go here. And the last one is another one, unauthorized. So all 3 of these things work exactly as we expect them to. This is what we wanted to see. One problem. I stopped us accessing the counter page. And if I go to the server and try and access that page directly, I will get that unauthorized. This is a Blazor static web app. This is running inside of my browser. If I click on this button, I'm not taking that round trip to the server, which means when you try and stop people accessing things on the client, make sure that you use that authorized view. Don't just rely on the static web app config file for that, because it's going to come back and bite you. Right, let's log in again. Now, I'm not going to log in with super user. I'm just going to log in without that, because what I want to show you with that one. We're not going to do the client again, but I do want to show you the two APIs. If I go to the authentication test, I get a 401 unauthorized. On the static web app, if I do this in production, I get a 403 forbidden. It actually gives me a different error message. If I go to test 2, here we go. I get data back. I'm allowed into my server. So you can see we can have that various different levels of access given to us by the roles that we're allowed. And just to prove to you that this does actually work, let's just log in with, hey, Google, why not? I clicked on the wrong button, but it doesn't matter. Let's log in with the super user. And then when we go through to that authentication test, I now get my data back and I'm a Google user. So that is how we can stop people getting access to the resources and making sure they can't load things they're not supposed to. What about limiting people's access to the authentication providers? If I have an application where I want to access somebody's Twitter account to do something, so I'm only interested in Twitter users. I don't want them to log in with Microsoft, with GitHub, or with Google. I'm only interested in Twitter accounts here. This, again, we do inside of our static web app config file. What we can do is add a route to that login AAD. So I'm looking at Microsoft here, so I'm restricting Azure Active Directory. And we can make sure that if somebody tries to access this, that they're going to get a 404 error. They're going to see page not found. So if we come back to our site and I say login with Microsoft, we get a 404 page not found. If you have your own internal authentication process, this is also super important because you're going to want to turn off every single authentication provider except for your customized one. So this is a really important trick to know. Final thing that I want to look at today in our flying tour is how to get those roles. When I logged in with Google, I logged in with this super user. But how do I get that on my production web app? Well, we do that inside of our portal. So if I switch to the Azure portal here, this is my static web app, and I'm going to look at role management here. In this blade in the portal, I can invite up to 25 different people and give them the roles that they need to have. What's really important here is it is 25 people who need a specialized role. There are no limit on the amount of people you can have logging into your application, but you can only have 25 roles or users with roles inside. If you need more than that, I'm afraid you've got to go for the standard tier. You have to pay that $10 a month. And then inside of this blade, you can have 25 users, which sounds similar because it is. I don't know why, but even in the paid version, you can only have 25 roles set up inside of this blade. What you can do is set up your own authentication provider and your own role management using a specialized Azure function. And then you can have as many roles as you want because you're the person taking care of it. So let's invite somebody and give somebody a super user role inside of our website. So we clicked on that invite link, and then we get to pick between Azure Active Directory, GitHub, that Facebook preview that doesn't work yet unless you're on the inside preview, the Twitter or Google preview. We're going to go for GitHub here, and I am going to add my GitHub account. If I can use my mouse correctly. There we go. I'm going to bring my GitHub account in, and I am going to give my GitHub account that super user role. I'm going to generate an invite, and you get this link here. I can copy this, open it in a new tab, and I have to consent. I've never used this GitHub account before, so I need to say that, yeah, of course, Microsoft can have access to my email address and username so that I can access this static web app. Important to let your users know this is going to happen. Grant consent. And now I'm logged in using my GitHub account. We can see up here, auth provided GitHub. I'm a super user, and that must mean that on my production site, I can actually get to that authentication test. And when the Azure function wakes up, because this is a cold start, we get our information back. Just to try and prove to you that I'm not cheating you, let's log out and log in with Twitter again. There we go. We're logged in with Twitter now. Blazor application's loading. And now if I go to that authentication test, we get that 403 forbidden. Like I say, production, you get a 403 forbidden, not a 401 forbidden. So that's it. That is a very lightning tour of authentication in Azure Static Web Apps. We've had a look at the different providers we have available. We have had a look at what information is available to us when we've logged in, and how we can use that information in our Blazor client and in our .NET function on the back end. We've had a look at how we can limit access to resources using user roles, and then we've had a look at how we can add those user roles into a production environment. There are more options available in the standard tier that you have to pay for, as I said, but we've covered the basics here, and it's a good grounding to get started. So well in tour. But if it's piqued your interest, I'm going to make sure that there's links in the show notes, which are going to go to the Microsoft Learn document so that you can give this a go for yourself. And like I say, I'm going to put a link to Anthony Chu's repo so that you can have a look how he did it. And I'm going to be making my repo available in the coming weeks. Thanks very much.
So thank you so much for the tour around Static Web Apps authentication, Stacy. I really like that you don't need to worry about all the intricacies of how the authentication is actually done, but you just have that, well, what was it again, .auth/me endpoint, where you can get those details. Really nice.
I think it's really awesome that you can do all of this. I mean, I am not an authentication expert, and I got this working inside of a couple of hours when I started playing with it. It's it really is. I don't know. It's websites for dummies. It allows you to just do really cool stuff really easily and without the code to go wrong. It's and I'm not storing any passwords. And I think the best password you store is none.
Oh, exactly. Definitely agree on that one.
Cool.
So my current blog is actually still running on WordPress, but I kind of tired of having to pay for that. So I'm looking to migrate it over to Static Web Apps. So I probably don't need any authentication on my personal blog, but I'm definitely looking forward to trying out that CLI that you showed us very briefly there. You mentioned that's in preview currently. Is that a public preview?
The CLI isn't a public preview. It is fairly mature. It's reasonably stable. I've not had a break on me for a couple of months. Occasionally they do change the parameter names, but I think that the ones that are there now are reasonably stable. They started off with simpler parameter names, so instead of API location, it was just API. But I think they changed it to API location because that matches the setup of an Azure Static Web App itself. So the GitHub action that you have there, you set up the API location. So they've tried to keep things matching.
Cool. Yeah, so we'll add a link to that also in the show notes. And I've also heard that you are currently hard at work at writing a book, right?
I am indeed. It's
so tell us all about it.
I am writing a book on how to get started with static web apps. It's for real beginners. You only need to have a basic knowledge of C# to get started. We go through the whole process of creating an Azure account, creating a GitHub account, and getting started with Git. And then we just, almost the example that I've shown here, we just create a static application using Blazor, WebAssembly, a .NET function. We get that deployed, and then we're actually going to turn it into a blog application where you can write your own blog entries and allow anybody to read them out.
Nice.
So maybe I just have to wait until your book is out, and then I can just use your sample code for my personal blog, right? That may be the best option for me.
You can probably make it look prettier than me, though. As you may notice, I'm not a CSS expert, so it's not going to
Neither
look
am I.
We're developers, right? So
yeah.
Yeah.
So once again, Stacy, thank you so much for giving us this tour.
Yeah.
And to those of you watching, thank you. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already done so, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.